Good evening and welcome. Tonight my name is Furman de Brabander. I'm chair of the Humanistic Studies Department here at Maryland Institute College of Art. We welcome you all to hear a talk given by Chris Hedges this evening, and this talk is sponsored by the Humanistic Studies Department. Chris Hedges, whose column is published Mondays on Truthdig, spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. He has reported from more than 50 countries and has worked for the Christian Science Monitor, National Public Radio, the Dallas Morning News, and the New York Times, for which he was a foreign correspondent for 15 years. He was part of a team of reporters at the New York Times awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 2002 for the paper's coverage of global terrorism. He has written 11 books, including Death of the Liberal Class, Empire of Illusion, The End of Illiteracy, and The Triumph of Spectacle, I Don't Believe in Atheists, and the best-selling American Fascists, The Christian Right, and the War on America. Several of his books are on sale upstairs, and he will be doing a book signing afterwards. And I learned this evening that he is currently working on, putting the final touches on, a book entitled Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, that he is working on collaboration with the illustrator Joe Sacco. So I will like to introduce Chris Hedges.
Thanks. I want to talk a little bit about sort of what's happened to the country, how we got to where we are, the importance, of course, of the Occupy movement, and then maybe touch a little bit on what Joe and I have spent the last 2 years doing in this book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. I was asked by Knopf to write a book on the press, and it was a good lesson for any of you who are writers. Never write someone else's idea. When I turned the manuscript in, Knopf read it and hated it. They offered to publish it after giving it to an editor who would excise what they call the negativity in the book. This is something that, of course, I wasn't going to do, and I got Nation Books. When you get a book advance, you get half of it up front. And I got Nation Books to pay off that half. And in that transition of sort of turning the manuscript over to another publisher, I began to reflect on what had happened in the broader society, that it hadn't just been the press that had collapsed, but all of the pillars of the liberal establishment that had collapsed. The liberal church, which I come out of, my father was a Presbyterian minister, and I am a seminary graduate, labor, education, and in particular public education, culture, which of course has become commercialized, and the Democratic Party. All of the pillars have essentially corroded to such an extent that we are helpless before the corporate onslaught, which is harvesting the country, a business term, where you essentially know that a business is doomed. One of the things you see is a lot of corporations will buy up newspapers. One is about to buy the Philadelphia Inquirer. They know that it has a limited lifespan, and they attempt to flush out as much money as they can. And I asked, how did it happen? How did we get here? That pushed me back to World War I. It was on the eve of World War I that powerful, progressive, and radical movements had effectively challenged the power elite within the society. You had about 36 socialist mayors in this country, radical publications like The Masses an appeal to reason, which had the fourth highest circulation in the United States. The socialist presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs in 1912 had polled 900,000 votes, or 6% of the vote. And to quote Dwight MacDonald, a writer I admire very much, the war was the rock on which all of these progressive and radical movements broke. And what happened is that there was no popular support for the war. In 1912, in fact, Wilson had run for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But with the collapse of Tsarist Russia, there became a very real possibility that about 100 divisions could be transferred from the Eastern to the Western Front. And Wall Street had lent tremendous sums of money to the British and the French. And if they were defeated, that money would never be paid back. That, coupled with the Kaiser's disastrous attempt to impose a naval blockade on England, which resulted in the sinking of 2 or 3 American ships, pushed the country into war. Wilson, however, knew that there was no public support for war. And there's an American intellectual who was very close to Wilson, named Walter Lippmann, who convinced Wilson that rather than use repressive measures authorized under the Espionage and Sedition Act to essentially create martial law, they could build an effective system of modern mass propaganda, which they did, called the Committee for Public Information, or the Creel Commission, named after a muckraking journalist named George Creel, who headed it and would end his career working for Joseph McCarthy in the McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. And this system of mass propaganda, which was the first modern propaganda machine of the 20th century, employed the understanding of mass and crowd psychology pioneered by figures like Le Bon, Trotter, and of course Sigmund Freud. And one of the father of public relations, Edward Bernays, who comes out of the Creel Commission, was, through marriage, Freud's nephew twice over. These propagandists grasped that populations were not moved by fact or reason, but through the skillful manipulation of emotion, or what Lippmann calls, in his book Public Opinion, the manufacturing of consent. So they established a film division out of Hollywood that made movies like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin. They established an extensive news bureau that pumped out daily pro-war news stories, and every paper in the country had to publish them. Indeed, it was a crime to be in your editorial pages opposed to the war. This saw the masses essentially shut down, appeal to reason, although the editorial stance had always been anti-war, did publish pro-war editorials until the end of the war, although it didn't save them after the war was over. They and the masses were both shut down. 45,000 speakers, known as 3-Minute Men, who were fanned out across the country, and after movies or public events would give short talks to promote the war. And if you read the writings of sort of great intellectuals and radicals like Randolph Bourne or Jane Addams, there is a disturbing undercurrent in all of their reflections about how easily the population or the masses were seduced into supporting the war. And what is particularly disconcerting to both Bourne and Addams is that the intellectual class was not immune. Many people who had been anti-war, many self-professed socialists, were swept up in this abstract campaign to make the world safe for democracy. Dwight MacDonald says, of course, that the war was the rock on which these progressive movements broke. He also says that none of the social theorists of the 19th century, including Karl Marx, anticipated the psychosis of permanent war. And what happened at the end of World War I is that once the war was over, the dreaded Hun instantly became the dreaded Red, so that the campaigns to ferret out internal enemies were transferred now towards communists or those who were soft on communism. Much of that work had already been done during the war. The harsher measures of the Espionage Act, Eugene Debs, by the way, just towards the end of the war, was placed in prison by Wilson, actually ran for president in the, I think, 1920 campaign from a prison cell. You had, after the war, with all of these movements being weakened, you had the government step in and shut down a series of publications and persecute radical organizations like the Wobblies, that anarcho-syndicalist union headed by Big Bill Haywood, who is accused of murder on trumped-up murder charges, flees the country, spends the last 10 years of his life in Moscow. Joe Hill, of course, another Wobbly organizer, picked up in Utah, accused of murder and hung. You have the old CIO. I mean, all of these forces are broken. They're shattered in the war, but broken. And all of the propagandists who had worked for the Committee for Public Information migrate to Madison Avenue and start working for corporations. And it is then that you see the traditional values of American society, thrift, self-effacement, all of that is overturned for the cult of the self. Corporations instill consumption as a kind of inner compulsion. And I think when we refer to American culture, what we're really referring to at this point is corporate culture. American culture was quite consciously and systematically destroyed. You saw not only the destruction of these radical movements, but the disemboweling of liberal institutions in the name of anti-communism. Perhaps the last time that the liberal class functions, and I think it's important to remember that the liberal class is designed as the political center. It was never designed as the political left. The liberal class functioned as a kind of safety valve whereby when there are widespread injustices or the unemployment of the depression and grievances, it makes incremental or piecemeal reform possible. So that when Conrad Black writes his biography of Roosevelt, he says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement is that he saved capitalism. And I think that's correct. And what happens, especially after World War II, with the McCarthy hearings, is that it is a final destruction. The radical movements have been largely snuffed out. Remember, in the 1960s, you had labor essentially siding with Nixon and opposed to the anti-war demonstrators in the streets. In fact, Lane Kirkland and George Meany passed resolutions supporting Nixon's war in Indochina and denouncing the long-haired hippies in the street. That's an example of the regression that labor made. And that severance between popular street demonstrations and labor essentially crippled the New Left in the 1960s. And of course, the New Left was hardly free from blame because it was dismissive of labor as a mobilizing force. In the 1950s, then, you see hundreds, thousands of university professors, high school teachers, artists, directors, journalists like I.F. Stone, probably 20th century's greatest investigative journalist, all become pariahs, pushed out of their jobs, cannot find employment. Stone couldn't even get a job at The Nation magazine. And at that point, we were essentially left disempowered. We had lost the radical movements, and remember, all of the true correctives to American democracy came through radical populist movements that never achieved formal positions of power. Whether it was the Liberty Party that fought slavery, whether it was the suffragists for women's rights, whether it was the labor movement, and finally, one could argue with the civil rights movement. And yet, these figures, a figure like Martin Luther King, at least until he was assassinated in April of 1968, You could argue that King was the most powerful figure in the United States because when he went to Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. The destruction of those radical forces and the disemboweling of the liberal class essentially left us without any forces by which we could protect ourselves from predatory corporate capitalism. And all of the advances that had been made in the New Deal were steadily dismantled, so that by the early 1970s, we shifted, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, from what he called an empire of production to an empire of consumption. We began to borrow to maintain both an empire and a lifestyle we could no longer afford. Sheldon Wolin, a political philosopher I admire very much, probably arguably our greatest living political philosopher, taught for many years at Berkeley and later at Princeton, in his book Democracy Incorporated, talks about the system of political governance that has evolved as to being one that he calls inverted totalitarianism. And by that he means it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in classical totalitarian regimes, you have reactionary or revolutionary forces that overthrow a structure and replace it. In inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces, anonymous, that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism, the Constitution, and yet internally have seized the levers of power as to render the citizen impotent. And corporate lobbyists, in essence, write every bill that gets passed, including, of course, Obamacare, which is an issue now in front of the Supreme Court. Obamacare becomes 2,000 pages written by the pharmaceutical and insurance industry, the equivalent of the bank bailout bill for these industries, which provides $400 billion in subsidies. And of course, there is no restriction on the ability of these corporations to increase co-payments, premiums, including on people on fixed income. One of the first things the Obama White House does after the bill is passed is grant exemptions to insurance corporations that do not want to insure chronically ill children, which in moral terms means that we live in a country where it is now legally permissible for corporations to hold sick children hostage while their parents bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughters. The Fisa Amendment Act, and I'm part of the ACLU, one of the plaintiffs on the ACLU case against this act. It was an act that Obama, as a candidate, said he would not only vote against, but would filibuster against. This was an act shoved through Congress by telecommunications lobbyists. Verizon, AT&T, these corporations had turned over phone records, communications of millions of American citizens to the government for storage, we know from a whistleblower, in direct violation of our constitutional right for privacy. And there were a series of cases working their way up in the lower courts challenging this decision on the part of corporations to turn over personal records to the government, and of course they knew they'd lose, so they wrote a piece of legislation that retroactively, this is what the Fisa Amendment Act does, retroactively made legal what under our Constitution is illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of American citizens, and this was a bill that Obama supported and voted for. The recent passage of the National Defense Authorization Act, which many of you may have followed, is just one more egregious assault by a corporate state that has been steadily stripping American citizens of basic civil liberties. We had already the passage of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act. Now, this was an awful piece of legislation. It took a radical interpretation of that legislation by John Yoo and others to justify, for instance, holding an American citizen, Jose Padilla, for 3.5 years in a military brig without access to a lawyer or due process. Padilla was allegedly a hijacker who never made it on a plane. Now that case worked its way up to the Supreme Court, but before it was heard, Padilla was passed over to a civilian court, and the Supreme Court did not issue a ruling saying that it was moot. It was Obama's interpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act that he claimed allowed the executive branch to serve as judge, jury, and executioner and order the assassination of an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, the cleric in Yemen. It is the 2001 Act that authorizes the ability in our offshore penal colonies to carry out what, under the Geneva Convention and every other accord on torture, defines as torture against people stripped of their rights and denied any kind of a due process. So what happens late last year with the National Defense Authorization Act is that we get a bill where there's no ambiguity left. Section 1021 of that bill, Section 1022 of that bill actually, and you should all go home and read it, it's pretty frightening Orwellian stuff, authorizes the executive branch to strip an American citizen of their legal rights if it is deemed in national security interests. The bill in Section 1021 permits the government to use the military to detain American citizens, to hold them indefinitely in military facilities, including offshore military facilities, i.e. black sites around the globe, until the end of hostilities. And those who are determined in the bill to be susceptible to that kind of treatment are what they call covered persons, are anyone who has any kind of link with associated forces, which is never spelled out, anyone who substantially supports any of these groups. And I think what's most disturbing about the bill is that these groups, many of these groups now didn't even exist in 9/11, that in the 2001 Act, it very specifically talked about Al-Qaeda and Taliban-related groups. Now it's amorphous. And there was a dispute, the Washington Post covered it at the end of last year between the White House and Carl Levin. The bill was sponsored by Levin and John McCain. There was a dispute over who would have the power to grant exemptions, i.e., who would decide which American citizens could be subject to this kind of draconian control and imprisonment, and who would be exempt. And the Obama administration wanted that solely in the hands of the executive branch. There was never a dispute about due process itself. Indeed, Dianne Feinstein, when she found that this piece of legislation would be applicable to American citizens, proposed inserting into the bill wording that would exempt Americans, and this wording was rejected, not only by the Obama administration, but by the Democratic Party. And I spent 4 hours this Friday giving a government deposition to federal lawyers in the lawsuit that I've now been joined by Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg, challenging the constitutionality of this bill, and we will go to court at 9 a.m. on Thursday morning at the Southern District Court of New York. If it is determined that I am a credible plaintiff in legal language, if I have standing, then the lawyers will immediately ask for a temporary injunction, which will hold this piece of legislation. It was signed on New Year's Eve by Obama when a lot of people weren't looking, and came into force at the beginning of this month, will essentially nullify this law until, of course, the government challenges it, and then we're going to have a tremendous fight on our hands. The rise of the corporate state, I think for me, was sort of typified by Bill Clinton. Clinton spoke in that traditional feel your pain language of the old liberal class, while assiduously carrying out the interests of corporations. It was under Clinton that we got NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the American working class since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act. It was under Clinton that we got the destruction of welfare. It was under Clinton and, of course, his Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers that we got the destruction of Glass-Steagall, the 1933 bill that put a firewall between investment and commercial banks. We have about 100 bank closures a year. In Canada, they have none because that firewall was never ripped down. And of course, Clinton understood that if he did corporate bidding, he would get corporate money. By the 1990s, the Democratic Party had fundraising parity with the Republicans, and by 2008, the Democrats got more. Obama actually got more. The price for this is that it becomes impossible for the American citizen, no matter who they vote for, to, in essence, vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs or ExxonMobil or any of these other large corporations. We are watching now Obama, who has managed to reverse himself on just about every campaign promise he made, shatter the campaign promises that he made about renewable energy, increase drilling on public lands, pass at least the lower portion of the XL pipeline. The danger of unfettered or unregulated corporate capitalism, which is now the world we live under, this world that Sheldon Wolin describes as inverted totalitarianism, is that, as Karl Marx understood, unfettered capitalism is a revolutionary force. It turns everything into a commodity that it exploits until exhaustion or collapse. Human beings become commodities, the natural world becomes a commodity, and that's why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. It's all about quarterly short-term profits. And Marx predicts rightly that because there is no impediment, essentially these systems cannibalize themselves. They have built within them forces of self-annihilation. There's a very fine book written in 1944 by a great economist named Karl Polanyi called The Great Transformation, in which he writes about what happens when capitalism is essentially unregulated. And he actually uses the word sacred. He said, when a society loses the capacity for the sacred, when nothing has an intrinsic value, then you essentially, that society builds within itself both a mafia political class and a mafia economic class that consumes itself until collapse. At this point, of course, any of you who read climate science reports understand that we have very little time left. The shredding of the Kyoto Accords in Copenhagen and the failure since, which were tepid enough, not to ratify any accords with any kind of teeth, means that the fossil fuel industry, in essence, drives our energy. We live in a country already where half of all electricity is provided by the burning of coal. The freak weather patterns. I live in Princeton, New Jersey. There was virtually no snow this winter. We've already seen in early March temperatures soaring up to 80 degrees. The droughts, and agronomists have determined that for every 1 degree rise in the Earth's temperature, there's a 10% reduction in crop yields. The consequences of catastrophic global warming are ones which will create such severe dislocations on the planet that it will become indeed extremely hard for systems of sustenance to even maintain themselves. I think when we saw the uprisings in the Middle East, especially in countries like Tunisia and Egypt, I think what the undercurrent of this was the first sort of glimpse into the breakdown of globalization. You have skyrocketing commodity prices. Wheat in the last year has increased in price by 100%, and that's why in the streets of Tunis or in the streets of Cairo, people were actually marching down the streets with bread. I mean, half of the Egyptian population lives on $2 a day, and when you're spending 50% of your income to eat, and commodity prices leap, quadruple or triple in price, then of course it becomes very hard to feed your children. And we're not immune from this within the United States. 47 million Americans live in poverty, and they're already spending, and tens of millions live in a category called near poverty, and they're spending now 35% roughly of their income in order to buy food. It's not a sustainable system, and yet these corporate forces, I come out of seminary. I mean, theologically, these are forces of death. They're forces that don't sustain life, but seek to exploit life for short-term profit, have absolutely iron control over our economy and our political system. And they know where we're headed, which is why they are rapidly cementing into place the security and surveillance state. Totalitarian systems, the first thing totalitarian systems always do is that they rewrite the laws. And that's precisely what has been happening. Obama has not found it even within his power to restore habeas corpus. And any of you, I don't know if any of you have been in the Occupy movements, but the militarization of city police forces. I was in after they shut down Zuccotti Park, I was in Foley Square, 35,000 people, and the entire section of Lower Manhattan was militarized by black uniformed police with visors and helmets and Kevlar vests and knee pads and command and control centers and helicopters up in the air with searchlights directing the police how to control the crowds and metal barricades. And we'd had a valid permit. We had a permit to hold the demonstration in Foley Square. And I think that that as the system unravels, George Orwell once said that all totalitarian systems rule through force and fraud. Well, the fraud is up, and force is all they have left, which is why the corporate state responds to the encampments of the Occupy movements by trying to physically erase them. It doesn't address the problems that drove people into these encampments. If we had a functioning liberal class that was able to hear the pain of the underclass and increasingly the middle class in this country, there would be an immediate moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions. There would be a forgiveness of the largest personal debt in the country, which is student debt, $1 trillion. And there would be a jobs program, a massive jobs program targeted especially at people under the age of 25. But that doesn't happen. The state has spoken to us in the only language that they are now capable of speaking to us in, and that is the language of force. And the physical or the external measures that have been employed against the Occupy movement have, I think, been matched by internal measures of infiltration and attempts to subvert both inside and out a movement that terrified the power elite because it articulated a fundamental truth, and that is all systems of power and systems of communication are in the service, in the language of the movement, of the 1%. And the rest of us don't matter. It doesn't matter what we want. It doesn't matter what we vote for. I was very critical in 2008 of Obama, and I remember talking to Dennis Kucinich, who I think understood Obama probably before many. He said, when I was a kid in Cleveland, I'd go to the ballpark and watch the baseball game, and the guys would go through selling scorecards. They say, get your scorecard, which were all the stats on each player. And he said, you need to take out Obama's 2-year voting record in the Senate because it's awful. It's one corporate giveaway after another. And in essence, what happened was the triumph of modern advertising, of modern public relations, of mass propaganda. Obama functioned, in essence, as a brand. He functioned in the same way that a few years ago Calvin Klein and Bennington and their big billboards used to use models, HIV-positive models or people of color, to associate a brand with a risque lifestyle and progressive politics. But the function, as with all brands, was to make passive consumers confuse a brand with an experience, so that after Obama wins the election, Advertising Age gives him its top annual award. He beat Nike, Apple, Zappos, and its Marketer of the Year, because the professionals knew precisely what he had done. All politics becomes about personal narrative, which of course is political theater. The engines of the corporate state remain virtually untouched. The looting of the U.S. Treasury, the largest transference of wealth upwards in American history, is carried out as assiduously by Barack Obama as it is by George W. Bush. As, of course, are imperial wars, including the war in Afghanistan, which, if you read the news reports carefully, you realize we are losing. And so where do we go? What do we do? The ability of the corporate state to dismantle manufacturing, to move it first over the border into Mexico, and now, of course, we see large-scale factory closures as these corporations pack up and leave for the cut-rate embrace of China's totalitarian capitalism, or Bangladesh, where people work in sweatshops making clothes for 22 cents an hour, or prison labor in China. And the American working class is repeatedly told that they must be competitive in a global marketplace, which means being competitive, of course, in an age of global neo-feudalism, where workers have no rights, no benefits, and are unable to make a living wage. I urge you all to read closely what conditions for workers are like in southern China. The New York Times did a nice piece on those who make Apple products. There's also, it's not particularly well written, but it's smart, a book by a sociologist out of Berkeley, Chang Lee, where he looks at these corporations where at the end of the month, if the profits are not what the factory owners anticipated, they simply won't even pay workers who will work 70 hours a week. Their legs swell because they never leave the floor, exposed to toxic conditions, live in overcrowded dormitories, and every month some of these workers who work like this will climb up to the tops of these dormitories and jump off and commit suicide. That's the kind of world in which we're headed. And these jobs, and in the New York Times series, they quoted Apple founder who told Obama bluntly that these jobs were never coming back. They were not coming back. So that cities across the country, and you all live in Baltimore, so it's hardly a surprise, the entire country is allowed to, these corporations are, in essence, allowed to hollow the country out from the inside. They are supranational. They have no loyalty to the nation state. They seek only to harvest what is left for profit, which is why you have hedge funds and huge charter schools and corporations going after the education budget. The federal government spends about $600 billion a year on education, and these people want it. And anytime hedge fund managers take a deep interest in education in the inner city, it's not because they care about teaching children to learn. They are seeking to break teachers' unions, to essentially send in people who are little more than temp workers to teach rote material, and destroy our system of education. There's a huge difference between teaching people how to think and teaching people what to think. And I think the whole assault against the humanities is an attempt to destroy people's capacity to think. We only have 100,000 humanities majors a year in any university, including Princeton, where I've taught. The humanities departments are withering. in state universities that don't have the endowments and resources of schools like Princeton. You have departments being tasked with raising all of their own money, their research money, money for salaries, and of course, it's very hard to do that if you're drama or philosophy or classics or English. And so with draconian budget cuts, I spoke not long ago at the University of Washington, 10% cuts, what do? They destroy the philosophy, and the drama departments are just obliterated, wiped out. Any academic discipline that makes possible the capacity for transformation, any academic discipline that teaches you to question structures and assumptions, these are not useful for the corporate state, and they are brutally pushed aside. And of course, now we're seeing the rise of these monstrous for-profit universities where they don't even offer any liberal arts education at all. It's all vocational. Everything becomes vocational at every tier within the educational system, including in the elite schools like Princeton. What happens in places like schools like that, or Harvard, where I went to graduate school, is that they get sucked right into Wall Street. 49% of the graduating class of Harvard a couple years ago went into financial services. Now, financial services, they're speculators. They don't produce anything. And in the 17th century, speculation was considered a crime. Speculators were hung. And yet today, they run the financial system and they run the government. And so what we've created on the upper end are systems managers. I mean, one of the things I find rather darkly amusing is watching the president run around talking about how we have to increase our educational programs, especially in science and technology, to be competitive. The fact is, the best educated people in this country were the ones who trashed it. People like Larry Summers, the youngest tenured economics professor at Harvard, later president of Harvard, Tim Geithner, these people all come out of the best institutions. The problem isn't a lack of education. The problem is greed. And these figures who come out of these elite institutions have essentially directed all public programs and all regulations to serving the interests of the 1% at the expense of everyone else. Now, the rise of the Occupy movement on September 17th in Zuccotti was extremely important because it articulated another narrative, not a narrative that is articulated by the corporate airwaves. Roughly about 6 corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, control almost everything most Americans see, watch, read, or hear. The real dialogue in this country is going on outside of these systems of communication, obsessed as they are with trivia and celebrity gossip, which of course is now leached into the news industry itself. News on the airwaves has become about ratings. It's become about attracting commercial dollars. There's almost no journalism left, which is a huge decline from when I began as a reporter 30 years ago. The Occupy spaces created realms by which the real issues that face us, whether it's the economic dislocation, whether it is the creation of an oligarchic state, and remember, democracies are not sustainable in oligarchic systems. This was something that Thucydides and Plutarch understood very well. The disease of empire, when Thucydides writes about what destroyed Athenian democracy, he says that the empire, or the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. The anti-democratic, repressive measures of control on the outer reaches of empire always migrate back into the heart of the empire, so that you have police forces that are essentially function as militarized units. And anybody who lives in a low-income neighborhood knows exactly what I'm talking about, where in the middle of the night or early in the morning, your door is kicked in by people who look like stormtroopers carrying automatic weapons. There is no difference between that and a night raid in Iraq on an Iraqi family. The ability to carry out surveillance wiretapping, monitoring, the police brutality. People in low-income neighborhoods have endured this for decades, and I think part of my problem with the liberal class is that it retreated into kind of boutique activism of multiculturalism and identity politics, which is fine. I'm not against any of that, but forgot about the primary issue of justice. So that while people of color were getting whacked, and while they were being foreclosed from their homes, and while there was stop and frisk and egregious acts of police brutality in their neighborhoods, the liberal class turned their backs on them. And I think part of that divide between essentially the Occupy movements in places like Zuccotti, which are, when they arose, which were characterized essentially by white middle-class kids who did everything right. I mean, you walked around Zuccotti and it was stunning the level of education that you could find, and got out there and realized that there was no place for them. It was only when the sons and daughters of the white middle class began to experience what the poor and people of color in this country have been experiencing for a few decades, that there began to be a kind of reaction. And I think that there is a justifiable distrust on the part of many people of color and many of the poor to the Occupy movement. And I've told many of the occupiers that one of their primary tasks is not only to rebuild bridges to these communities, but in many ways to walk in there and ask for forgiveness, because the liberal class did abandon working men and women. They did abandon the poor in this country. And if we have any hope of fighting back, we have to re-galvanize ourselves around issues of justice for all Americans, especially those who have suffered the most. I mean, the civil rights movement was a legal victory. It was an economic disaster. It integrated perhaps the upper third, roughly, of African Americans into the middle class, although if you look statistically at what's happening in the middle class, African Americans are being disenfranchised from the middle class at a much faster rate than white Americans. Not a surprise. But for the bottom two-thirds of African Americans in this country, life is essentially worse than it was when King marched on Selma. And the power of the Occupy movement is that it suddenly addressed these narratives. Before the rise of the Occupy movement, everybody was talking about a deficit crisis. We don't have a deficit crisis. We have a revenue crisis when we have corporations like General Electric or Bank of America that pay no taxes. These people pull in billions of dollars a year and contribute absolutely nothing to the country. We have a revenue crisis when the head of Walmart makes $11,000 an hour, and the average worker in Walmart, who works about 28 hours a week, their wages put them below the poverty line. Indeed, if you work at Walmart, one of the first things the Walton family will do to you is hand you applications for food stamps because you qualify. In essence, we subsidize the Walton fortune. Things have gotten so wildly out of control. Everything, and what's happened among this oligarchic elite is that they've retreated, absolutely severed themselves from the mainstream. I mean, if you look at the kinds of gated communities that they live in, it's become like Versailles or the Forbidden City. They've completely lost touch with what's happening on the outside, which is why it's so dangerous. And without a functioning liberal class as a kind of safety valve, without a mechanism to make incremental or piecemeal reform possible, what happens, to quote Dostoevsky, who was obsessed with this. I mean, if you remember Demons, his novel Demons, or Notes from Underground, it's about the defeated dreamer. It's about the defeated liberal. It's about Mouse Man, who went to all the Obama rallies and chanted, "Yes, we can," and is just cynical and in despair. And when that liberal class breaks down, Dostoevsky writes, you enter an age of moral nihilism, which is precisely where we are. If the state is successful in shutting down the Occupy movements, and it's certainly working overtime to do so, and let's be very, very clear that Barack Obama has his hands in this. He is culpable. Those first 18 encampments were all shut down in a coordinated effort with the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, out of Washington. He knows they're a threat because they expose the mendacity and corruption of the Democratic Party itself. If those movements are shut down, then we are going to see violence. We will see the kinds of activities that we have seen in Greece. And I spent 20 years as a war correspondent. I know what violence is rather too intimately. I don't want to go there. I have been very vocal against the black bloc anarchists because I believe that the power of the movement and the threat of the movement is that it is, in essence, a mainstream movement. It articulates the aspirations and the hopes and the grievances of the mainstream, which is why, if you went to Zuccotti Park, you would see on any weekend mothers and fathers from New Jersey with strollers going up, and that terrified the state. If they can sever it from the mainstream, if they can, through organizations like Van Jones, Rebuilding the Dream, or whatever it's called, funnel that energy back into a dead political system, they can thwart it. I don't know what's going to happen. No one knows. I've covered movements all over the world. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany. I covered the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. I covered the 2 Palestinian uprisings. I only know that movements have a kind of force or life of their own, which even the purported leaders of the movements don't grasp or understand. The demonstrations against the East German state, arguably the Stasi was the most effective secret police network in the history of the human race, although we may have beat them to it at this point, began with Lutheran pastors and a few congregants walking through the streets of Leipzig with candles, and it's 70 this week and 120 this week, and then suddenly it's 70,000. What is it that triggers that? Even they don't know. I was with the leaders of the East German opposition on the afternoon of November 9th, 1989, and they said, well, maybe, within a year, we'll have free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Within a few hours, the Berlin Wall, at least as an impediment to human traffic, did not exist. Even they had no idea. And I think that the tinder is there. I think the grievances are there. I think the will is there to respond. But if the response of the state is essentially to crush, and Occupy has been a nonviolent movement, to crush the nonviolent movement, then eventually the rage is not going to go away. You will begin to get the anarchic acts of violence that we have seen in Greece. And in some ways, that's precisely what the state wants, because it can contain it. The language of force is the language the state speaks. It's the only language they have left that they speak, and they have the tools and ability and resources to fight on that level in a way that we do not. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, Homeland Security, internal security in this country now employs, according to Dana Priest of the Washington Post, 1 million people. There are whole suburbs outside of Washington that essentially function as private security firms that are contracted to the state. And of course, when they're not working for the state, they're working for corporations. Civil disobedience is the only weapon we have left. It's imperative that those of us who care about thwarting the rise of a corporate totalitarianism engage in those acts of civil disobedience. I think it's vital that we remain nonviolent because that, and not only nonviolent but transparent. Václav Havel in 1978 wrote a wonderful essay called The Power of the Powerless, and it is essentially in a kind of, it's counterintuitive, but it is our powerlessness that gives us our greatest power, because we are exposing a rotten system for what it is. And it is rotten, and the people within that system understand far better than we do how rotten that system is. That by carrying out repeated acts of nonviolent civil disobedience, which includes treating blue uniform police with respect, although they often I will admit, don't deserve it. What you're doing is essentially going after the pillars that hold up that power structure. Civil servants, police, government bureaucrats, government officials, and creating divisions within those power structures, which creates a kind of paralysis. And I saw that in East Germany, that when the demonstrations in Leipzig became massive, Erich Honecker, who had been the dictator for 19 years, sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowds. And when the paratroopers got there, they wouldn't shoot. At that point, any regime is over. Honecker lasted another week. People forget that the Russian Revolution was a non-violent revolution, at least on the part of the revolutionists. The armed putsch was orchestrated by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, but the Tsar had already abdicated. It was used against Kerensky and the transitional government. What broke the Russian Revolution was when they kept sending the Cossacks, especially in Petrograd, to attack the rioters who were breaking into food warehouses because there were terrible food shortages, and they not only wouldn't fire on the crowd, but they started fraternizing with the crowd. Then you're done. And I think that, if in New York, all of these cops are essentially, by night, to moonlight, they're rent-a-cops. They work for places like Goldman Sachs for $37 an hour. They watch these guys in their $8,000 suits walk by them as they walk by the rest of the service staff as if they're invisible. And I think that the state has become so distorted and so corrupt, they're extremely vulnerable on that point and extremely frightened, which is why they have reacted the way they have. I'm just going to end a little bit and talk about the book. Joe Sacco, I don't know if you know Joe Sacco's work. He's a comic, graphic illustrator, great journalist. I met him in Bosnia. He was doing a book called Garajda, and I'm not a reader of comics, but I watched him work and realized that he was really an amazing reporter. And what he does is he reports the story out, but then he draws it. And it gives it a kind of power that you can't do in prose, because everything becomes visual, especially these sort of emotional highs. I'll give you an example. If you're in a refugee camp in Gaza, and we did a story together for Harper's Magazine, and it's raining and it's muddy, you can say a few times to the reader that it's muddy. But when you draw it out, every single frame shows the rain and the mud. You also have the capacity to go back in time so that you can show what the refugee camps looked like in 1948 and what they look like now. We did a story out of southern West Virginia with a 92-year-old miner who went into the mines when he was 17, shortly after his father was killed in a mine accident when it was not mechanized. They were using mules, non-unionized, and Joe had the ability to show essentially that whole trajectory of his life. The only time he leaves West Virginia is in World War II, and he's drafted. He goes to the Battle of the Bulge, and he's wounded. So we set out to go to the sacrifice zones, the pockets of the worst poverty in the United States, Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in America, also the most dangerous, usually not one or two on the list. Pine Ridge, South Dakota, where you have the average life expectancy of a male is 48, the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. The coal fields of southern West Virginia, where mining companies are destroying the Appalachian Mountains. They don't want to dig for coal anymore. They just want to blow the top 400, 500 feet off the tops of mountains, expose coal seams. It never comes back. The streams are poisoned. The air is poisoned. Cancer is an epidemic. We went into villages where everybody, including the kids, had their gallbladders removed. The water's poisoned and fetid. The Appalachian Mountains function as the lungs of the eastern seaboard, not to mention the watershed. And then the tomato fields in Florida, where the undocumented workers function in conditions that often resemble literally slavery. Because that's the world we're creating. That's where they're pushing us towards. It's a complete configuration as sort of anticipated by Orwell in 1984 in the state of Oceania, where you have the inter-party sanctum, which is about 4 or 5%, you have the sort of corporate managerial class, which is about 13%, and the rest are the proles, people who live on a kind of subsistence day-to-day level, barely making it. And we're already very, very far down that road. We wanted to show what these sacrifice zones look like. We wanted to show what they did to families, what they did to communities, what they did to ecosystems. And we end with, when we began the book 2 years ago, the working title was Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, but revolt was conjecture. We knew that without impediments there would be blowback. We didn't know what it would look like, and towards the end of the book, Zuccotti arose, and so the last chapter is on Zuccotti. Systems of defiance, systems of civil disobedience, which includes going to jail. Not a pleasant experience. Some of you have probably been in jail. As Wendell Berry says, when he occupied the governor's office in Kentucky over mountaintop removal, going to jail is more time than I care to donate to the U.S. government. But I'm afraid, along with other moral voices in this country, Cornel West, Bill McKibben, and others, it's really the only option we have left if we're going to save ourselves. And it's about your generation. It's about the generation of my children. By allowing this system to cement itself, we've betrayed you. And I have kids, and I go out there and do what I do. Was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs because, even if I fail, I want my kids to look back and say, he tried. Thank you. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Well, I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war, and the city was completely surrounded by Serb forces. We were being hit with 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. 45 foreign reporters had been killed by the time I got there. If you sat in a basement during that shelling, as I did, with Sarajevans and tried to talk about pacifism, you would have been laughed out of the room. We knew what would happen if the Serbs broke through that trench system. A third of the city would be slaughtered, and the rest would be driven into refugee and displacement camps. That's what happened in the Drina Valley. It's what happened in Vukovar. And yet, once you employ violence, you're not free from the poison of violence. That's the tragedy of violence. Violence, for me, is always tragic. So that the people who first organized the defenses of the city were gangsters, Cello and others. They came out of the criminal class. They had access to weapons and a penchant for violence. And when they weren't shooting at Serbs, they were raiding the apartments of ethnic Serbs who had remained behind in the city, looting them and often executing them. So yes, I covered the war in El Salvador when the death squads were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month. One understands why you pick up a weapon, but at that point it's always dark. And I think part of the imperative to carry out acts of civil disobedience now is to protect a civil society so we don't descend into that kind of tragic bloodshed. Well, we know what went on in Greece, which is a government masked the size of its debt, courtesy of Goldman Sachs, so that they could borrow far beyond their ability to repay. None of this was done publicly. It's not the fault of the Greek people. And it's the fault of rapacious bankers, and in particular Goldman Sachs, that made a fortune out of it. And now the Greek people, like the American people, are being told they have to pay for it. That's what the word austerity is about. So you have Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, AIG. They implode the world financial system. They evaporate $40 trillion in worldwide wealth. And then they suck it all out of the American taxpayer, which they have, I mean, we bailed out Goldman Sachs, and now the government gives them zero-interest loans. I don't even know whether you can call that capitalism. And we're made to pay for it. It is so grossly unfair. And, the world's not black and white. Yeah, I mean, Greeks are not good about paying taxes, but how does that compare with General Electric or Bank of America? I mean, the crime of a Greek shop owner evading taxes doesn't even begin to be matched by the fact that essentially we live in two worlds. We live in a world where the very elite write their own laws. In essence, it's lawless. And then there's another set of regulations for the rest of us. And I think that's something that the Occupy movement began to expose. So, I think what's happened in Greece, as what's happened in Ireland, Italy. I mean, what happened when Papandreou said we have to put this to a referendum? Well, the bankers went into a fit because they knew the Greeks wouldn't pass it. And so they got rid of Papandreou and put in a banker. I mean, that's what happened. And it's just a small window into how they control both our political and our economic system. I mean, I look at Obama as a lawyer, and he works for his clients. And if you want to know who his clients are, read who his biggest campaign donors are. She's asking about jobs and what kind of jobs would you propose, and then how do you deal with corporations. Infrastructure. I mean, anybody who's been to Europe will tell you, I mean, I come down on Amtrak. I was to come like really early because I don't know how many times it's going to break down. I mean, what do these cars go at? 60 miles an hour? I mean, it's a joke. I mean, I'm about to go to France. I get on the TGV, it's 180 miles an hour. We have absolutely the most antiquated system of public transportation in the industrialized world. Our roads are falling apart, our bridges are falling apart, our schools are falling. There's a shortage of jobs. It's just nobody wants to invest. So, laying off teachers, I mean, out of Camden, it kind of replicates the rise of the corporate state. 75% of the city budget is spent on police and fire. That's it. Police and fire. That's what they want. We had public works programs, writers' projects in the Depression. There's no shortage of work that needs to be done. But of course, the state isn't going to fund it. In terms of the corporate power, if we don't break the back of corporate power, then they'll kill us. That's what's happening. Quite literally, they'll kill the ecosystem. They know no limit. I don't know whether they're just stupid or whether they believe that they can live in their little gated compound and it won't affect them. I don't know what they think. But they will kill us, and they'll kill our children. And that's why we have to get out. The only thing left is to get out in the street. And I'm not naive enough to even promise you that it will work. But if you think voting is going to affect it, then I think you live in a non-reality-based universe. Well, I mean, on the issue of demoralization, I was a war correspondent for many years, and we never used the word optimist or pessimist. You coldly tried to figure out what weapons systems were at the end of that road and how you would respond to them and what their capacity to kill you were. People had a very Pollyannish view that somehow they wouldn't be shot, or, I knew a journalist who, when we were in Sarajevo, the city was completely surrounded and there was a stretch of the airport that was under direct Serb fire. And he would get up every morning in a car, a thin-skinned car, which means he didn't have an armored like I did, and drive across the tarmac as Serb shooters would fire at him until he got to a Croatian town called Kiseljak, and he would buy cigars and he would smoke them on the way back as they would shoot at him again. And he spray-painted on the side of his car, "Save your bullets, I'm immortal," until, of course, he got shot. I don't think we can talk about hope if we can't talk about reality. And to invest our hope into systems, into essentially dead systems, is a recipe for despair. Any of you who are in Occupy movements will tell you that those were greatly empowering and invigorating moments, and filled with hope. I don't think they were hopeless. I think what's hopeless is isolation. What's hopeless is not resisting. What's hopeless is investing your energy and your hope in a system that isn't going to respond. And I think many, many people in 2008 invested a lot of hope in Barack Obama and feel very deeply betrayed. And I think part of my call is a kind of call to examine systems of power and how they work, because you can't effectively resist those systems if you don't understand how they work. And I would encourage you to look at Wolin's book, Democracy Incorporated, where I think he does a very good job of laying out how power is allocated in the United States. No. You can go all the way back to, it doesn't matter what we want. And, Obama, there's not a campaign promise Obama hasn't broken, because we're not relevant as political forces. 2006, the Democrats retake control of the Congress on the issue of the Iraq War. And what do? They continue to fund the war. They raise the troop levels in Iraq by 30. They just ignore us. And that's just true on every single issue, because we don't have any money, because this is a money-saturated system. And, there's not accidental that every member of Congress is a millionaire, or that they finish, like Chris Dodd, and they start working for the corporations they were working for inside the legislative branch. The whole issue of super PACs. It's not just that super PACs can destroy you if you defy corporate interests. It's that you now know as an elected official that if you defy the interests of these corporate entities, you can't appeal to them, and they will make sure you're pushed out of office. So that we see it, it's observable during the election cycle, but in fact it's now perpetual, courtesy of the 2010 Supreme Court ruling Citizens United. So, no, the system's dead. Look, every totalitarian country I covered, including Syria and Iran and Egypt, they all had elections. They love the game of it, as if there's any kind of a meaningful choice. Let's just forget about the economy and neo-feudalism. Let's just talk about the environment. We've known about global warming since the 1970s. If we were a rational species, we would have begun doing something about it. Let's do one more. Yeah, I think they're selling Death of the Liberal Class out there. Grab it, because it's 200 pages on that. How do we get here? And the short answer is they took populist movements and broke them and destroyed them. And then they took the liberal institutions, which were at least not tone deaf to the average citizen, and destroyed those too. And so we essentially were left powerless. That's the really short answer. And they knew damn well what they were doing. For instance, they went after Ralph Nader, big time. The whole rise of these right-wing think tank all came to destroy Nader. Nader was an incredibly powerful personage in the 1960s. He wrote 24 pieces of legislation that the liberal wing of the Democratic Party put into law. The Mine and Safety Act, the Clean Water Act, OSHA, it was all written by Nader. And they had to turn him into a political pariah, and that's not a supposition. You can read Lewis Powell's memo when he was the counsel for the Chamber of Commerce. He later goes to the Supreme Court, where he writes precisely that. He writes, we have to get Nader. I print it in my book. They knew who they had to destroy, and they did. And somebody talks about, I think one of the persons asked a question about, the Occupy movement and popular issues. In fact, if you look at the polling, the Occupy movement on almost every single major issue represented the vast majority of Americans, whether it was on the public option, whether it was on a moratorium on foreclosures, bank repossessions, whether it was hostility to the bailing out of Wall Street. If you want a window into how distorted the political system has become, the Occupy movement is the mainstream movement. All of the issues that, and we know from poll after poll, the majority of Americans not only are concerned about but support, are not articulated in the political spectrum and not articulated on the corporate airwaves. There are no meaningful discussions there anymore. Well, I can tell you from having spent a lot of time at Zuccotti, it was a middle-class movement. And, that was part of its problem. There weren't a lot of poor people there. Yes, the police were dropping homeless off and that kind of stuff, but the engine of the movement was white and middle class. And what I think what freaked Bloomberg and the power elite out was the fact that there was support. Remember, suddenly contributions started pouring in. FedEx packages were pouring in with sleeping bags and generators, unsolicited. Food. They put up on a website, here are the restaurants nearest we were awash in food. Okay, it was mostly pizza, but still. And it did resonate within the mainstream. That's why the state reacted the way they did. So I think that's also why they crushed it. Because that narrative, that discussion, that shifting of the narrative was one that is disastrous for the corporate duopoly that holds power. 35,000 people in the middle of New York City is not a small demonstration. And the police were damn sure that was never going to happen again. It's why when people marched last weekend down to Zuccotti Park, and it wasn't a very large group, it was a couple hundred people, the police went berserk. They were savage in terms of beatings, 70 arrests. They put barricades around. They're terrified that it will reimplant itself. And they wouldn't be this frightened if they didn't see it as a threat. So I think that what they cannot or what they do not want is for this movement to spread. And that's what they're working overtime to make sure will not happen. Thank you very much.